Hi, this is History MD coming to you with the conclusion of our very first book review, The Origins of Human Disease. In our previous two episodes, we found out that both our hunter-gatherer ancestors and their farmer offspring appear to have been healthier than modern humans. McKeown's chief villain in his Origins of Human Disease is industry. So the transition to agriculture occurred in a period of a few thousand years. It had a large effect on health and population growth. The change to industry, however, took place in a much shorter amount of time, just a few hundred years. Its effects on health and population growth have been even more profound, chiefly as a result of the decline in infections and their replacement by non-communicable diseases. McKeown refers to the increase in numbers which began around the end of the 17th century and has continued ever since as the modern rise of population. When cultivation of plants and domestication of animals began, the population of the world was below 10 million. By 1830, it had increased to 1 billion, and in just under 2 centuries, it has multiplied eightfold. The modern rise is distinguished from all previous increases by its size, its continuity, and its duration. McKeown attributes both the modern rise of population and the associated transformation of health to the decline of mortality from infectious diseases. There certainly has been a general overall health improvement following the Industrial Revolution. In developed countries, most people now have enough to eat. Their drinking water is pure, sewerage is dealt with cleanly and efficiently. The risks of exposure and death from airborne infections are generally reduced by effective medical measures, and the risk of infection from food, although still present, is greatly reduced. But the decline of the infections has led to a new pattern of disease, most clearly reflected in changes in the common causes of death. Infectious diseases are no longer the leading cause, as cancer and cardiovascular diseases now account for about 2/3 of all deaths. These might be thought of as underlying diseases, which are largely determined by genes that were formerly obscured by the shortness of life and the predominance of infections. However, McKeown believes that the predominant causes of sickness and death in the developed world are due chiefly to conditions associated with industrialization and urbanization. So in a way, the non-communicable diseases can be regarded as the price to pay for the advance in overall health over the past few centuries. In summary, according to McKeown, the transformation of health and rapid rise of population in the West during the last 3 centuries have a common explanation. They resulted from a decline of mortality from infectious diseases. The infections declined mainly for 2 reasons: increased resistance to the diseases due to improved nutrition, and reduced exposure to infection, which followed the hygienic measures introduced progressively from the late 19th century onwards, such as washing of our hands, for instance. Meanwhile, the contribution of medical treatment and immunization to the decline of mortality was delayed until the 20th century and was small in relation to that of other influences. Now, McKeown concludes his first part concerning disease history by writing that in spite of the enormous diversity in the nature of diseases, the common causes of sickness and death are essentially determined by the prevailing conditions of life. The contemporary pattern of ill health in developed countries is attributable to environmental hazards, some of which have resulted from industrialization, while others have much more in common with those of the prehistoric period. But the recent profound change in disease pattern from infectious to non-communicable is a unique phenomenon in human experience. The new diseases have been called diseases of civilization, associated with industrialization, Western diseases, or as McKeown prefers to refer, as diseases of affluence, in contrast to those which he refers to as diseases of poverty. Although he does recognize that the terms are not entirely satisfactory, because impoverished populations are increasingly exposed to risks of affluence, tobacco, alcohol, drugs, and the like, and the people of developed countries are by no means all protected from the ill effects of poverty. McKeown's most fundamental conclusion is that except when determined at or soon after fertilization, disease is not an inescapable attribute of the human condition. Disease results from unhealthy ways of life and can be prevented if those ways are changed. The destructive influences are of two kinds: deficiencies of basic resources, of which food is by far the most important, and exposure to hazards, which may be either natural, mainly from parasites, or man-made, from conditions that man has created for himself. Health depends primarily on removal of the long-standing deficiencies and hazards which led to the predominance of infectious diseases, without provoking the risks from non-communicable diseases that have appeared in the last few centuries as a result of the maladaptation and hazards associated with industrialization. Now, let's go over some of the key arguments of McKeown relating to disease history. A. In the period of hunting and gathering, man was unable to effectively control his environment or limit his reproduction. But as he was well adapted to the conditions of life through natural selection, non-communicable diseases were rare, as they are in other primates living in their natural habitats right now. The shortness of life of hunter-gatherers was due mainly to food deficiency, acting directly through starvation and malnutrition, or indirectly through environmental hazards and infectious diseases. B. Under agriculture, there was a beginning of control of the environment and an increase in food supplies, which led to a decline of mortality and expansion of numbers. But reproduction was not effectively restricted, and populations increased to the size at which food supplies became again marginal. Many of the basic conditions of life were unchanged. Non-communicable diseases were still rare, but living together in large numbers and unhygienic conditions, human beings had inadvertently created precisely the condition required for the propagation and transmission of many infective organisms. So infectious diseases became the predominant cause of sickness and death with agriculture. C. Industrialization extended control of the environment, and the large increase in food supplies and later reduction of hygienic risk altogether led to the decline of infections. Populations expanded, but at a rate more or less consistent with health requirements. However, industrialization created conditions of life far removed from those under which man evolved, and non-communicable diseases displayed the infections as the common causes of sickness and death. So, in pre-medieval times, there were no effective control of neither the environment nor reproduction. With agriculture, there was some control of the environment, but not over reproduction. And in the industrial era, there was further control of the environment, and for the first time in human history, of reproduction. But insufficient control of conditions of life created by industrialization led to a different form of sickness and death. Concerning disease origins, McKeown writes the following: the diseases determined after fertilization, aka genetic diseases, cannot be prevented by environmental changes. All other diseases have environmental as well as genetic components in their etiology and are therefore potentially preventable. These are the diseases of poverty and affluence. In developing countries, advances are almost entirely attributable to improved nutrition, as in some places there were no substantial improvements in water, sanitation, and personal health services, and immunization coverage was low. But still, there were advances in overall health because of improved nutrition. The effects of poverty are also manifested through various hazards, particularly exposure to infectious diseases through defective hygiene and aggravation of large populations. McKeown regards non-communicable diseases, which have largely displaced infections in developed countries, as new diseases attributable to conditions of life brought about by industrialization. That the new disease pattern in the developed world is due largely to maladaptation is strongly suggested by the fact that profound changes in ways of life have occurred in the last few centuries when the genetic constitution of the modern human population has remained the same. However, some of the diseases cannot be attributed to maladaptation, for they are due to hazards created by industrialization such as road traffic, pesticides, atmospheric pollution, and the like, in which the risks are determined almost entirely by the new environment that we have created for ourselves. For the future, McKeown has some advices. In developing countries, the most urgent requirement for health is to improve nutrition. In developed countries, the greatest advance that could be made in health would be elimination of the substantial inequalities that still exist between poor and well-to-do people. This is as much an economic as a medical problem. For removal of health inequalities requires redistribution of wealth and probably depends finally on the elimination of poverty. In the world today, ill health is due less to lack of resources than to their uneven redistribution between and within nations. And as such, bridging the wealth gap to create better health for all is our main takeaway from McKeown's conclusion. Well, if you liked the video, be sure to leave a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and state your historical emergency in the comments below. Thanks for watching!